Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. We have a packed show for you this week, as we'll be ranging over a number of issues, domestic and foreign. I say foreign because, Bernard, you are far from Scotland this week, aren't you?
I'm in the great state of Vermont, where I arrived a couple of days ago, took the Amtrak train from New York all the way up New York State, and I'm in Bellington in Vermont, which is just a couple of miles inside the state line.
That's a lovely part of the world. I remember going to a wedding near there many, many years ago and so on. You're there keeping a close eye on the latest developments in the American presidential election, and you have wisely gone to one of the safest states in the country to do so.
Yeah. Do we want to start with that, or do we want to come back with the issue of the presidential?
Perhaps we'll come back to that. Perhaps we'll start off with the Labour Party, the Labour government. Labour are holding their conference as we're recording this episode, and then we'll have a look at the latest developments in Scottish politics over the last few days. John Swinney's remarks on the SNP's strategy for independence, where the Scottish government is just now, and then perhaps circle back to the lesser event of the American presidential election.
Okay, well, starting with the Labour Party conference, I suppose that they've got one major objective this week, and that is to try and bring a bit of feel-good factor to the party, because they get off to, I suppose, a relatively ropey start. If we look at the approval ratings for Sir Keir Starmer, they've plummeted really rather quickly. Why? Well, a lot of the messaging from the new government has been deliberately downbeat, deliberately saying that things are going to get worse before they get better. This is all about preparing the country, in a sense, for bad news. Now, I think the calculation there is that further on down the line, if the economy does begin to rebound, if Labour do manage to address the crisis in public services, Starmer will get the credit for eyeballing the country and at least being honest. But the problem is that downbeat message also comes at a time where, of course, we've got the abolition of the winter fuel payments, where there is real, genuine kickback, not only within the broader party and trade union movement, but there's also some kickback, I think, within the electorate as well. And then there's this third issue which has emerged in recent days, in the last week, which is that all of these monies and clothes which have come courtesy of Lord Ali, which I think is, in some respects, the most damaging of everything. Why? Because sometimes voters do not follow the nuance of policy decisions that government take. But what they can do is that they can look at something, and they can look at a prime minister who, he and his wife, are earning over £200,000 a year, who live in North London, who are probably millionaires, probably multi-millionaires, who feel the need to take expensive clothing from a multi-millionaire Labour peer. And this from a prime minister whose pitch to the country just a matter of weeks ago was change is on the way. Change from what? Change from the sleaze of the Conservative years. This, I think, will enrage ordinary Labour folk in the country. I think people who supported the Labour Party on the 4th of July are going to look at some of this stuff and they're going to say, is this what change looks like? Is this what a millionaire Labour Prime Minister looks like, where he's accepting all of these kind of gifts? It stinks. It stinks. They are no different. And in a sense, this week, they've got to get a feel-good party for the party, feel-good factor for the party. But in a sense, we're going to have to look at Starmer's speech and to see whether or not there is any contrition for what, in my opinion, are absolutely basic issues of misjudgment on his part.
Yes, I mean, on one level, Labour peer donates suits to Labour Prime Minister isn't a great scandal, but you're absolutely right that the way it is perceived is causing the government an awful lot of difficulty. I think the row over Sue Gray Starmer's chief of staff, the row over her salary, the fact that she is earning more than the Prime Minister. Again, something that I think could have been very easily avoided by ensuring that she didn't earn more than the Prime Minister. She would have only had to forego a few £1,000s, and suddenly there is no story there. I think you have a number of other things coming into play. In a curious way, I think the government has been hampered by the fact that the election took place in early July. Because you then had the whole of the summer recess at Westminster, and people are waiting for the government to get going, to start acting, to start governing, to start doing things. And you effectively had an almost 2-month hiatus as a result of the parliamentary calendar and the political holiday season, in which not a huge amount was happening. And the only message that was really coming from the government was this doom and gloom mantra that, things are going to be difficult, the budget is going to be brutal, that we shouldn't expect any kind of short-term, quick-fix turnaround in national fortunes. And I think you could also argue that message has perhaps been too successful, curiously, that people have bought it completely. And so you now have this Labour conference taking place, and people are thinking, well, what is the point of the new government? If it isn't going to change things, if it isn't going to bring a bit of hope and optimism. And so that reset is required, because, as I say, I think the messaging has been quite successful. I mean, there was a sharp drop in consumer confidence, according to figures that were released last week. And that, it suggests that people have been buying the government's message, but buying it too completely. So, yes, you can see why they want to pin responsibility for their inheritance on the Conservative Party, but you couple the doom and gloom message with the easily avoidable errors of accepting lavish amounts of gifts from Lord Ali and from other people, and you create a situation where the newspapers in particular can make hay with it all, because they'll say, well, look, this lot are no different from anybody else. And when your election message is, as Keir Starmer said, we are a government of service. Well, quite a lot of voters right now, it looks more like a government of self-service. And that, I think, is a problem. In the long run, I would suggest, but maybe I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. So in the long run, I suspect that a lot of this will eventually be seen as initial teething problems, that it won't actually have any long-term political effect in the same way as, Tony Blair used to take free holidays from wealthy donors and other rich businessmen and so on. And people thought that was a bit naff, but it didn't actually damage the Blair government in a significant way. I think in the longer term, as the government gets up and running, a lot of this stuff will be forgotten. But at the moment, I think it's a problem.
I agree with you up to a point that longer term, this will not matter. The success of the government, as we both have agreed many times before, rests on their ability to get economic growth. If they don't get economic growth, this government will have big problems come the next election. That's the big picture. But why is this row over clothing so important? I would suggest it's important for this reason. Whatever people thought about Keir Starmer before the election, a lot of people in the Labour left said he stands for nothing. He's an absolute opportunist. All of this kind of stuff. And there were others who say, no, he's pragmatic. He's taking a pragmatic route to get us back into government, because without government, we can do absolutely nothing. Now, one of the things that Starmer was quite good at doing was giving the Conservatives no targets to aim at during the election campaign. And the reason that he managed to do that was that his judgment in terms of the broader politics, I think, was sound in terms of strategy. I'm not saying in terms of lack of content and policy detail. You can criticize him for that. I think that rightly, you can criticize him for that. But in terms of the strategy of getting Labour along the line, he was taking all the right calls, and it appeared that he was a safe pair of hands. This is a basic misjudgment. It is a stunning misjudgment, and it not only goes to him, it goes to his deputy leader as well. And you remember in the early days of New Labour, Tony Blair said, we have to be whiter than white, and then the whole Bernie Ecclestone row enveloped him. This is a misjudgment about Starmer, and if he's capable of making a misjudgment on this, And then there's the issue about his season ticket Arsenal Football Club, where he appears to be rotating around corporate boxes and all of that. Whereas the judgment should have been, I'm going to resile from attending home games until after I'm Prime Minister, because I don't want any other avenues attack coming up in preferential treatment for Prime Minister. These are easy judgments for Starmer to make, and he has made the wrong calls. And I think for the first time, perhaps in his leadership, the question is if he's capable of making the wrong call on something as basic as this, is he going to start making the wrong calls on policy? Because some people think he's made the wrong call in terms of the winter fuel allowance. So that there are now questions over his leadership early in the days of the government that I would not have expected this early.
No, I'd agree with that. I mean, it is a series of own goals, if you like, and as you say, and consequently self-inflicted. I mean, literally so. I think it's also the case that you've got a number of other things happening, and so on. There's a lot of leaking from within the government, a lot of special advisors who are perhaps enjoying their newfound status, inexperienced in the role, but very much enjoying the opportunity to sound off to journalists, making the mistake of thinking that journalists have their interests at heart, and are, if you like, a sounding board. You know, this is not the case. I mean, nobody should really. I mean, from a journalistic point of view, we are obviously predisposed to support leaking and off-the-record briefing and all the rest of it and so on. This is vital for our trade and adds significantly to the gaiety of the nation. But from the government's point of view and so on, nobody should be talking to journalists nearly as much as they are. And so you have a degree of indiscipline there, I think. And again, you have this sense that the government has this huge majority, but it's quite shallow in certain respects in the way its vote and support is distributed across the country extremely efficiently, but not necessarily on a repeatable basis. And they are discovering that however difficult it is being in opposition, life in government is vastly more difficult and brings with it a significantly greater amount of scrutiny, and that scrutiny is invariably pitiless.
Yeah, well, in our next podcast, we'll be unpicking everything that happens at the Labour conference, including the Prime Minister's speech. Now, we also want to talk today about certain suggestions about Labour SNP cooperation after the 2026 election. But let's bridge this by what's happening over the pond where I am at the moment. Just some context in the most recent polls, which I was checking this morning. This is an average of the last 10 polls. Kamala Harris is on 49.2%, and Donald Trump is on 45.8%. Of course, that nationwide figure is substantially meaningless because this is not a one-voter election in the sense that you simply tally up all the votes, and the one who gets the highest number of votes becomes the president because of the electoral college system which operates here. 538 electoral college votes, 270 is the magic figure that you need to get over the line. And of course, back in 2016, when Donald Trump won the presidential election, he won it on the electoral college vote, despite the fact that Hillary Clinton got almost 3 million more votes in the popular vote. So carrying the popular vote is not the important thing, which is why these poll averages across the country, in a sense, give us an indication of where it might go, but it's not absolutely definitive. And before I go into some of the figures in the swing states, I've been looking about the polls in some of the swing states. From your position, Alex, how's it looking? It was looking pretty bad for the Democrats when Biden was still in the White House. It's looking a whole lot better, but a lot of people still saying that the election is too close to call.
Oh, I think functionally it is too close to call, and you're absolutely right. You know, I think that if the Democrats had not mounted a coup against Joe Biden, a coup led in large part by Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House of Representatives, then I think Donald Trump would be a odds-on favorite to return to the White House after the election in November. I think getting rid of Biden, who voters understood was simply no longer up to the task of being president in 4 years' time, and possibly not up to the task physically or mentally, at least in terms of how people saw him next year or even this November. So I think that has salvaged the Democrats' chances. Kamala Harris becomes the nominee. There's a great surge in enthusiasm. The Democrats have a pretty successful convention. And then, it's a bit of a roller coaster ride, because suddenly people are thinking, well, hang on a minute, this is all great. Things are going in the right direction. The Democrats are back in the game. But actually, if you start looking at the Electoral College mathematics, as you say, if you look at the polling in the swing states, places of, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania in particular, then it is far too close to call. So despite all this momentum behind Harris, vast amounts of money being poured into the Democratic campaign, despite the fact that Trump is an incoherent candidate in every sense of the term, it is still very, very difficult to call. So that you then have a sense of despair almost in the Democratic camp, and then you have a bit more polling that says, well, okay, actually maybe those concerns have been a little bit overblown, and so there's then a rising tide of optimism once again. And I think fundamentally all of that really goes to demonstrate is that the race is functionally tied. I would expect, as you say, Harris to win the Democratic vote, the popular vote, but the Electoral College is where it counts. And so you have a degree, I would say that Harris's difficulty is that as far as the median American voter is concerned, particularly in swing states in the Midwest, she is a woman. She is from California. She is a black woman from California. All of these things say to your bang average American voter that Kamala Harris is very liberal, very left-wing by American standards, and significantly to the left of the median American voter. And so dispelling that to some extent, I think, is one of her great challenges. So it was interesting, I think, when you saw her a couple of days ago, she was talking about, well, if somebody breaks into my house, damn straight, I'm going to shoot her. I have a gun. Now, that's the sort of thing that will strike a lot of people in the UK and in other European countries as a weird and extraordinary way of carrying on, a weird and extraordinary way of talking. But for American voters, it is very important that you demonstrate that you are in tune with the typical American voter. And so that was the significance of that. And it's precisely because Harris is, if you like, left-coded, that she has to work extra hard to dispel some of the assumptions, some of the perhaps slightly lazy assumptions that people have about her, and to make it clear that they can vote for her with a degree of comfort. And I think that is crucial. And the extent to which she succeeds in doing that, I think, will have a major bearing on her chances of winning the election in November.
Just in terms of what's dominating headlines here in the United States today, that line about shooting an intruder, the line now is that it was said in jest. So already she's sort of rowing back from that particular line. The second thing is that CNN have invited both the candidates to a head-to-head debate on the 23rd of October. She has accepted that. Donald Trump, who initially couldn't get enough of the debates, is saying, no, I'm not going to take part in that because it is widely regarded, and I think correctly, that he lost the first debate. And why go into a second debate when it looks that she is simply, in debating terms, sharper than he is? And the reason that he is giving today is that voting in some of the states has already started. So this debate on the 23rd of October is way too late. But it's interesting in terms of just the way in which the mood music has gone. Biden in office looks good for Trump. Biden announces he's not going to run. Harris gets a boost. Then there's that attempted assassination of Donald Trump, and then that sort of muddies the waters. Then there's the first debate, and she then pulls ahead, certainly in terms of the popular vote across the country. And the sense, I think, now is that the momentum may well be with her. But of course, the key thing, as you pointed out, Alex, is what are the key swing states saying? Because most of the states will vote in the way in which they always vote. You can color some of them in Republican and some of them in Democratic as we speak. Well, Pennsylvania, 19 electoral college votes in Pennsylvania. Harris has a 1.9% lead in Pennsylvania. But of course, with the margin of error, you could put that down as too close to call. In Virginia, 13 electoral college votes. The average of the last 4 polls in Virginia, Harris has a very comfortable 7.5% lead. Arizona, 11 electoral college votes. That's one which went into the Democratic column last time around. Donald Trump, on the basis of the last 5 polls, has a lead of 0.4%. So it's hardly a lead at all. Georgia, huge at the last election. Georgia went Democratic, 16 electoral college votes. Across all polls in this election, Trump is enjoying a lead, but only of 1.6%. Michigan, 15 electoral college votes. Harris is plus 3.2% across all polls. North Carolina, 16 electoral college votes. Trump is 0.6% ahead in all polls. What are these polls in the swing states telling us? They're telling us that in a lot of these states, it is too close to call. But rather interestingly, in the states, in the swing states, where Harris is ahead, she's ahead by a greater margin than Trump is ahead in other swing states. Trump is ahead by such a small margin that it's almost a dead heat. So it may well be pointing at the stage as if it's looking towards Harris. But of course, a lot can change between now and Tuesday, the 5th of November.
Absolutely. I mean, it's quite possible that the American presidential election, and consequently, in many respects, the future of the Western world over the next few years will be decided by as few as 50 or 60,000 voters across those half dozen vital swing states, as you say. I'm sure we'll come back to some of this stuff over the next sort of 6 weeks. But if we return to our own midden, if you like, but then
speak for yourself.
It's a glorious Indian summer at present. You've disappeared from these shores during the best week of weather all year, and I'm currently in the Hebrides on the Isle of Jura and so on, where it is a spectacularly beautiful evening. And what better setting is there for contemplating the fate of the Scottish government and the future of Scottish politics? We've obviously, over the last few days, there's been an awful lot of discussion about the 10th anniversary of the independence referendum in 2014. John Swinney gave a speech on Wednesday that was quite interesting, I thought, in as much as, although he said that, of course, independence remains our priority, which is something that he has to say to the SNP to keep the troops happy, he also conceded effectively that there will be no independence referendum at any point in the future, in the immediate or foreseeable future, I should say. This is, in certain respects, a concession to plainly observable reality, because no external analysts or pundits or politicians from other parties think that there is any possibility of an independence referendum this decade, really. So Swinney was forced to sort of pivot, I think, and say, well, yes, we have to grudgingly accept that the country isn't with us yet on this. The country isn't yet ready to redetermine its long-term constitutional future. And my sense of this, Bernard, and I'd again like to hear what you think of it, was that in a way, this was John Swinney quietly going back to an old SNP policy, an old SNP position, which was effectively the position held in 2015. After the referendum, the SNP has this great upsurge in membership. It wins 56 out of 59 Scottish constituencies in 2015, but it has no way of reopening the referendum box. And so effectively, they concede that for something to change, you would have to have support for independence at something like 60% of the electorate for a prolonged period of time, generally understood to be 6 months, a year at least, before you could justify reopening the national question. And that is functionally where the SNP is now. And so we have agreed to pretend that much of the last 8 years, the ceaseless agitation for a second referendum, the marching of the troops up Mount Referendum only to march them back down again, leaving, Nicola Sturgeon looking rather like the Duchess of York, if you like. I mean, not the actual current Duchess of York, but, but you know what I mean. All of that has been wiped away, and we are back to where we were in 2015.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the immediate consideration is that if they were to press an unambiguous strategy in terms of a route to independence or a call for another referendum and put at the heart of the campaign in 2026, John Swinney believes therein lies electoral disaster. I suspect that they're hoping that they'll be able to pin some of the blame on the next difficult couple of years on the Labour government at Westminster. And as we've been discussing, if Starmer is as sure-footed or as club-footed as he's been to date, who knows what could happen in 2026. It's not a done deal at all that the SNP will lose in 2026. But I think he thinks that if they are to put independence centre stage, that would grease their slide from office. It's really rather interesting in terms, and here I make an observation on the broader Yes movement, the way in which it is now hopelessly split in strategic terms. Last Saturday night, I was one of 3 journalists who were sharing their thoughts with an audience of independent supporters at the Science Centre in Glasgow. And whilst most of the speakers who were there, Alec Neil, Michelle Thompson, Joanna Cherry, Philippa Whitford, Fergus Ewing, were all members of the SNP, the audience was overwhelmingly, I would have said, sympathetic to the Alapa party. The observations that were made on the current SNP administration by most of that audience, I could not repeat. And what we have now...
Please do, though, Bernard. Please do.
No, we are not immune. We are not immune from the laws of defamation, Alex. We are not immune. Now, what is perfectly clear is that within the broader Yes movement, John Swinney is, if you like, a new pragmatist, fundamentalists and gradualists it used to be in the old days pre-devolution. Swinney is now a gradualist in that he's saying we have to now take this incrementally. Alapa and people within the Yes movement who don't support Alapa but who perhaps share their frustration and analysis are now the new fundamentalists. And one of the problems from the broader Yes movement in 2026 is that you're going to have some people on the Yes side who are going to say, the SNP are betraying the cause of Scottish independence. In fact, their campaign is going to be vote for us because you can't trust them to deliver. And the SNP will be running what might be regarded by many as a pragmatic campaign, but it is one which is not going to engage with anyone else on the Yes side of the argument. This discussion which took place at the recent SNP conference and these debates about we need a big tent approach, there's only one problem with that. They're not going to get into the tent. You can't have a big tent approach if you can't get them into the tent. Therefore, strategically, the Yes movement are now completely and utterly all over the place. And I suspect that what we're going to see in 2026 is pro-independence parties, perhaps even the Greens, but certainly Alapa, make it as their pitch. Not only are the SNP government incompetent in policy terms, they cannot be trusted on the Constitution. And well, that leaves the electoral arithmetic after 2026. Well, I don't know.
Well, there's a lot of stuff there. There's a lot of potential for a remarkable parliament to be elected in 2026. If you look at current opinion polling, and of course this may change, there's a long way to go before the election, but current opinion polling, for instance, is suggesting that Reform could win, 8, 9, 10, even 11, 12% of the vote on the regional list. calculations made by Professors John Curtis suggest that could be enough for reform to return between 12 and 16 MSPs. The Greens will continue to be a presence. The Liberal Democrats will hold on where they want. Alba will hope to pick up a couple of seats themselves, taking advantage of the splits in the Yes movement that you rightly talk about. And so you create a situation in which you will have, once again, a kind of rainbow parliament back, just as we did once upon a time when the Tommy Sheridan and his Scottish Socialists were elected. But it will be a very different type of parliament in 2026. And the electoral or the parliamentary arithmetic may be such that it will actually be very difficult to form any kind of government, which conveniently brings me on to an observation made by Stewart McDonald, friend of the show, who has been on the show before, and we'll have him on again, I'm sure, in the future, former SNP MP for Glasgow South. He has floated, he's not the first person to float it, but he's the first, if you like, serious SNP figure to float this possibility, that after the 2026 election, you may be in a new environment in which a Labour SNP coalition of sorts is the most viable and certainly the most stable government to be that could be formed. And he draws a comparison with the Republic of Ireland, where Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, long-time rivals, adversaries, enemies, dating back to the Irish Civil War and the formation of both parties, have nevertheless at times been able to form a coalition government. I think there's a slight difference there because the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael coalition there with a rotating Taoiseach, taking it in turns to serve, has primarily been a way of keeping Sinn Féin out of government. And I'm not sure that the same dynamic applies in Scotland, even if you were to mischievously suggest that the Scottish Conservatives and Sinn Féin were somehow analogous in these comparisons. But nevertheless, once such an idea is floated, it's quite difficult to hammer it back into a box and sink it, unfloat it. And there is a certain amount of sense to it, in as much as if you put the constitutional question to one side, then there is a clear overlap in many respects between most SNP supporters and most Labour Party supporters, and most SNP members and most Labour members. So you can see how it makes sense, but it would be such a revolution in Scottish political affairs, given the events of the last quarter century, that it would require heroic leaps of imagination, I think, from both parties. And it would require, I think, the SNP to accept that there will be no movement on the national question.
Yeah, I was appearing on another podcast a few weeks ago in which I said that should Scotland ever become independent and there was no constitutional question and you have a proportional voting system, I could foresee circumstances when Labour and the SNP actually could work in the national interest in a coalition. Because whatever else you think of them, Labour are a social democratic party of sorts. Now, you can debate how robustly social democratic they are. That's perfectly legitimate, and whether or not Starmer is a social democrat and all that kind of stuff. The SNP are a social democratic party of sorts, and you can debate whether or not John Swinney and Fergus Ewing are robustly social democratic or not. But clearly they are parties of the centre-left, and clearly they have a lot in common. And yes, they should be able to work together. And if there was no constitutional question which was driving a tribalism between them, then there is no reason why they shouldn't. It won't happen, and it won't happen for another reasons. First of all, the tribalism. These two parties are the Celtic and Rangers of the political world. There are just certain things you do not do, and you do not cooperate with them. Secondly, if Labour emerge as the largest party in 2026, I think it would be incomprehensible if Labour took the initiative on the issue of cooperation with the SNP, because in those circumstances, the SNP would have lost the election. If they've been in power for 19 years and have lost the election, I think it's impossible to foresee circumstances in which Anas Sarwar would say, well, in the national interests, let's have a coalition with them. And the third thing, it requires an embrace of a different kind of politics, a kind of politics, incidentally, that devolution was supposed to deliver. It would take the advent of a new politics, which simply ain't here yet. Therefore, for a whole series of reasons, tribal reasons, pragmatic reasons, Labour couldn't be seen to be propping up a party which had lost the election. This ain't going to run in 2026. But depending on how messy the arithmetic is, it's perfectly possible you could take Labour as the largest party and add on the Liberal Democrat total and add on the Green total, and you might not be at 65, depending on how Reform are polling and depending on how Alapa are polling. It could be a very messy parliament, completely uncharted territory, but utterly fascinating territory at that.
Absolutely. And we'll come back to many of these things in due course in future episodes of the show. I must say that every time I hear people talking about a new politics, I reach for my cattle prod, which is the most effective way of dealing with this nonsense, because there is no such thing as a new politics. Politics is politics, and it is made up of people, and that is why it is often so infuriating for so many, in so many respects. But you're absolutely right that ancient atavistic hatreds and so on do not melt away just because parliamentary arithmetic necessarily suggests that it would be an opportune moment for them to do so. But that brings us to the conclusion of this episode of the show. It's been great speaking with you, as always, Bernard. I hope you're enjoying your time in the United States. Where are you off to next?
Boston on Wednesday, and then back to New York, and then back to, I hope, is still sunny Scotland on the 1st of October. But from me here in beautiful Vermont, it's goodbye.
And from me on the Isle of Jura, it's also goodbye.